Ann Parker sighed as she leaned back into the plush cushions of her living room sofa, the soft hum of an afternoon breeze wafting through the slightly open window. It was one of those rare days when the world outside seemed to slow down, leaving her alone with her thoughts in the comfortable suburban home she had meticulously maintained. A half-empty cup of chamomile tea sat forgotten on the side table, its warmth long gone, as was the vibrant energy she once felt for the life she now led. Ashley exuded effortless elegance at 40, her auburn hair falling in soft waves past her shoulders, and her deep green eyes, which often carried a weight of introspection that revealed more than she intended, including herself. Life had been kind in material terms, but less so in matters of the heart. She had no children of her own, but she adored Ethan, her 21-year-old godson, who felt more like a nephew given their familial bond. Ethan, the son of her late best friend, had spent numerous summers in this house. However, as he grew older and attended college, their visits became less frequent and more formal. Today, Ashley thought she was alone. Ashley decided to reward herself after spending the majority of the morning organizing the kitchen and sorting through an endless pile of old photographs. Wrapped in her favorite silk robe, she settled into the familiar embrace of her sofa with a glass of wine, her mind wandering aimlessly as the afternoon's muted light cast shadows across the room. The wine, rich and velvety, slid down her throat as she closed her eyes and savored the moment of silence. She didn't hear the car pull into the driveway, nor did she notice the faint sound of footsteps approaching the door. Ashley was lost in her own world, unaware that Ethan had returned, having realized he had left his phone behind after a brief visit the previous day. Ethan, who was familiar with her habit of leaving the front door unlocked, pushed it open without hesitation, expecting to retrieve his forgotten device and leave unnoticed. The creak of the door startled her, breaking through the silence like a needle dragging across vinyl. Ashley sat up abruptly, her heart racing in her throat. She barely had time to adjust her robe before Ethan walked into the living room, his arrival unexpected and completely unannounced. Aunt, he began, his voice trailing as he took in the scene before him. Ashley froze, locking her gaze with Ethan's as the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them. She was acutely aware of the way her robe clung to her figure, the silk catching the light in a way that made her feel exposed, despite being covered. Her cheeks flushed a deep serum sun, a wave of embarrassment washing over her as Ethan's wide eyes betrayed his own discomfort. "Ethan," she stammered, her voice trembling as she instinctively tightened the robe around her. "What are you doing here?" Ethan averted his gaze, his eyes burning red, and rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I left my phone here yesterday. I didn't mean to." He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence as his words trailed off. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Ashley felt heat rise in her chest, her embarrassment heightened by the fact that she had completely let her guard down. Her mind raced, looking for something to say that would calm the situation. "You should have knocked," she said with a sharper tone than she intended. She immediately regretted her words, which sounded more accusatory than she intended. "I'm sorry," Ethan replied quickly, his voice earnest. I didn't know." Ashley sighed and ran a hand through her hair, attempting to compose herself. "It's fine," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "Just give me a minute." Ethan nodded, stepping back toward the doorway to give her space. But the awkwardness persisted, palpable and unavoidable. Ashley stood, adjusting her robe and brushing invisible lint from the fabric as she walked down the hallway. "I'll get your phone," she said, her voice firmer in an attempt to reclaim some sense of control. Ethan paused before stepping aside, his movements hesitant and uncertain. "It's on the kitchen counter," he admitted, his tone apologetic. Ashley retreated into the kitchen, grateful for the brief respite. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge while taking a deep, steadying breath. The cool granite beneath her palms kept her grounded, but the scene replayed itself in her mind with vivid clarity. She couldn't get past the image of Ethan's face, which was a mix of surprise and There was something else in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. She retrieved the phone, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface as she exhaled slowly to calm herself. She returned to the living room, holding the phone up to Ethan with a forced smile. "Here?" she said simply, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she was experiencing internally. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly. He hesitated, as if looking for the right words, but then said nothing else. He took the phone from her, and their fingers briefly touched during the exchange. The contact was brief, but it left an impression, a spark of something neither of them fully understood but shared. Ashley walked him to the door with measured and deliberate steps. She wished the moment would end, for him to leave, so she could reclaim the quiet solace of her afternoon. But as Ethan stepped onto the porch, he paused and turned to face her. "I didn't mean to make things weird," he said, his eyes genuine. "I really am sorry." Ashley gave a small smile, her heart softening despite itself. "It's fine, Ethan. Just knock next time. Okay?" He nodded, a faint smile playing across his lips. "I will. Promise." Ashley closed the door behind him as he walked to his car, leaning against it with a deep breath. The house felt different now, the stillness no longer comforting but charged with an energy she couldn't identify. She returned to the sofa, her tea cold and her wine unfinished, her mind racing with ideas she couldn't shake. Ashley spent the rest of the afternoon trying to shake the lingering sensation that something had changed between them. She told herself it was nothing but an awkward moment that would pass with time. But deep down, she knew better. The way Ethan looked at her and the way her heart reacted were unforgettable. And, as the sun fell lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Ashley couldn't help but wonder what the days ahead would hold. The house was almost unnaturally quiet, interrupted only by the faint ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Annan Parker sat alone at the dining table, her fingers tracing random circles on the smooth wood. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, despite the fact that Ethan had only left a few minutes before, clutching his phone tightly in his hand. The sound of his footsteps on the porch echoed in her mind, mingling with the rush of emotions she'd worked so hard to suppress. Her heart was still racing, with a persistent thud in her chest that refused to stop. She looked down at the table, her thoughts swirling into a jumble of confusion and embarrassment. The image of Ethan standing in the living room, his expression a mix of surprise and apology, replayed itself with almost cruel clarity. She felt exposed, vulnerable, in ways she hadn't expected, and no amount of rationalizing could take away the weight of the moment they had shared. Ashley stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. She needed to move, to do something, anything, to relieve the oppressive tension that clung to her like a second skin. Her bare feet tapped softly against the cool tiles as she wandered aimlessly through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she reached for the sink. She turned on the faucet, and the rush of cold water provided a small, calming comfort. Splashing it on her face, she allowed the chill to bring her back to reality, if only briefly. But the reprieve was short-lived. As she straightened up and saw her reflection in the window above the sink, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her auburn hair was slightly disheveled, her green eyes wide and searching, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Guilt? Shame? Or is it something deeper? Something she wasn't prepared to face? The sound of a car engine revving in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Ashley froze, her breath catching in her throat, as she listened carefully. When she heard the familiar creak of the front porch steps, her pulse quickened again. He was back. Ethan did not knock this time. The door opened quietly, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, still holding his phone. His expression was hesitant, and his dark eyes searched the room before settling on her. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching taut between them. "I forgot my charger," he finally admitted, his voice low and uncertain. Ashley blinked, trying to find her voice. It's in the living room," she said, her words sounding more like a question than an answer. Ethan nodded, his gaze remaining on her for a moment before turning and walking back toward the living room. Ashley exhaled sharply, gripping the sink's edge to keep herself steady. She could hear him moving around in the other room, including the faint rustle of fabric and the soft creak of furniture. The sounds were painfully mundane, but they seemed charged with an intensity that could not be ignored. When Ethan returned, charger in hand, he hesitated in the doorway again. Ashley turned to face him, arms crossed over her chest in an unconscious act of self-defense. Their gazes locked, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in the dimly lit kitchen. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," Ethan interrupted the silence. His tone was sincere, and his words were cautious, as if he were treading on delicate ground. "You didn't," Ashley responded too quickly. Her voice was strained, and she could tell it wasn't convincing. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other while fidgeting with the charger. "I should have knocked," he admitted, lowering his gaze to the floor. "Didn't even think." Ashley nodded as her throat tightened. "It's fine, actually. Let's just forget about it." Even as she spoke, the words rang hollow. Forgetting was not an option, especially since the memory of the event was so vivid in her mind. She could still see his eyes widen in surprise, and he stumbled over his words as he attempted to explain himself. And she could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks, as if her heart was racing to get out of her chest. Ethan looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers again. There was something there, unsaid and unsettling, that made her breath catch. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he explained softly. "You didn't," Ashley repeated, her voice quieter this time, but the words felt like a lie. She was uncomfortable, but not in the way he thought. The silence between them was heavy, full of unspoken emotions that neither of them dared to express. Ashley shifted her weight, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. She wanted to say something to relieve the tension in the air, but her mind was blank and her thoughts jumbled. "I should go," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. He turned toward the door, but paused and looked back at her over his shoulder.
"I'm sorry, Antash."
The use of the nickname, which he had given her since he was a boy, served as a stark reminder of the boundaries they had always shared, boundaries that now felt blurred and uncertain. "It's okay," Ashley said, barely above a whisper. "Really?" Ethan nodded, and then he was gone, the sound of the door closing behind him leaving an almost deafening silence. Ashley stood there for a long time, her hands still gripping the counter and staring at the empty doorway. Her mind raced, replaying every detail of their interaction with a sharpness that felt almost cruel. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that it was just an awkward moment that they'd both move on from. But deep down, she knew better. The tension that had developed between them was not easily dismissed. It was a small but undeniable spark that threatened to ignite something far more complicated than she was prepared to deal with. Ashley couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning as she turned off the kitchen light and retreated to the quiet of her bedroom. Something had changed between them, something she couldn't identify but couldn't deny. And as she lay awake in the stillness of the night, staring at the faint patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, she wondered how long they could continue to pretend that nothing had changed. The air in the house had changed, but Ashley had no idea when or how. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it clung to the walls, filling the silence between her and Ethan. Days had passed since their awkward encounter, but the memory still lingered in her mind, replaying itself with cruel precision. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, to convince herself that it was only a fleeting moment of embarrassment, the tension persisted. She found herself acutely aware of everything. The sound of Ethan's footsteps as he moved through the house appeared louder and more deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. Even the most insignificant interactions, passing each other in the hallway, exchanging brief pleasantries in the kitchen, felt charged with an unspoken energy that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Ashley felt the brunt of it on Sunday afternoon. She was in the living room, curled up on the sofa, a book in her lap. Though she had long stopped reading, The words on the page blended together as her mind wandered, consumed by thoughts she couldn't shake. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Ethan was upstairs, and despite not seeing him all morning, she was acutely aware of his presence. The faint creak of the staircase interrupted the silence, sending a jolt through her. Ashley's fingers tightened around the book as she heard his footsteps descend. She forced herself to relax, taking a deep breath and looking up, just as Ethan entered the room. "Hey," he said casually with an undertone of hesitation. "Hey," Ashley responded, her tone equally measured. She closed the book and set it aside, sitting up straighter. "Have you slept well?" "Yeah, I guess," he replied, running his hand through his hair. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to enter or retreat. After a pause, he took a step deeper into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. Ashley watched him, her heart racing despite herself. She despised how aware she was of him, of the way his dark eyes lingered on her, of how his presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was both comforting and disturbing. She shifted slightly, crossing her legs in an attempt to appear calm. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked, her voice a little too bright and forced. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile forming on the corner of his lips. "I'm good, thanks." An awkward silence ensued, stretching between them like an invisible thread. Ashley could feel it, taut and fragile, poised to snap at any time. She looked at the coffee table, suddenly conscious of the empty wine glass she had forgotten to bring to the kitchen. It felt like a minor, obvious detail, a reminder of the vulnerability she had demonstrated in recent days. "I was thinking of heading out for a bit," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. "Maybe go for a walk or something." "Sounds nice," Ashley said, her tone polite but distant. She reached for the book again, returning to the page she had left off, knowing she would be unable to concentrate. Ethan paused, as if waiting for her to say something more, but when she didn't respond, he nodded and turned away. Ashley watched him leave, and the tension in her chest eased slightly as his footsteps faded down the hallway. But the relief was fleeting, replaced by a nagging unease that she couldn't shake. Later that evening, Ashley found herself in the kitchen, preparing dinner with almost obsessive precision. She chopped vegetables with deliberate care, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board providing some comfort in the otherwise silent house. Ethan had returned from his walk hours ago, but he had kept to himself, and Ashley appreciated the privacy. She was stirring a pot on the stove when she heard him come in. She didn't turn around, staying focused on the task at hand as she felt him approach. His presence was palpable. A warmth seemed to emanate from him and fill the room. "Smells good," he said, breaking the silence. "Thanks," Ashley said, her tone clipped. She reached for the salt and sprinkled it into the pot with a steady hand. "It'll be ready in a few minutes." Ethan did not respond immediately. When she finally looked over her shoulder, she saw him leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. Something in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper, made her pulse race. "You've been quiet today," he said with a light but probing tone. Ashley shrugged and returned to the stove. "Just busy," she explained, keeping her voice neutral. "Are you busy avoiding me?" Ethan asked, and, despite his teasing tone, his words had a sharp edge that made her stomach twist. Ashley froze, her hand tightening around the spoon as she struggled to calm herself. She forced a laugh, which sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Don't be ridiculous." Ethan pushed off the counter and moved closer until he was standing beside her. "Am I, though?" he inquired, his voice now lower and more serious. Ashley turned towards him, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. "What are you talking about, Ethan?" "You know what I'm talking about," he said, his dark eyes catching her gaze. "Things have been different, and I think you feel it, don't you?" Ashley's breath caught, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the intensity in his voice and the way he looked at her made that impossible. "I think you're reading too much into this," she said, her voice trembling. She returned to the stove, hoping to conclude the conversation, but Ethan did not move. Maybe, he replied softly. But maybe I'm not. Ashley gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, struggling to maintain her composure. The intensity of his voice and presence was overwhelming. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and wanted to retreat or hide. "Dinner's ready," she announced abruptly, her voice louder than necessary. She turned off the stove and reached for the plates, moving quickly. Ethan didn't press the issue, but as they sat down to eat, their silence spoke volumes. The tension that had settled over the house was not going away, and Ashley knew it was only a matter of time before it escalated. The evening was shrouded in an unsettling stillness that seemed to magnify every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind outside. The house felt smaller somehow, its walls closing in as Ashley moved through it, her every step heavy with the weight of the previous few days. She had tried to shake the unease that had settled over her, to dismiss the memories that lingered in her head like unanswered questions. But tonight, the tension was too strong to ignore. The soft glow of the living room lamp cast long shadows across the walls as Ashley sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweater. The book she'd been pretending to read lay abandoned on the coffee table, its pages open to a chapter she couldn't remember beginning. Her thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the fragments of conversations and fleeting glances exchanged between her and Ethan. He was upstairs. She realized this because she could hear the faint murmur of his footsteps as he moved around his room. The sound was a quiet reminder of his presence, with a steady rhythm that both soothed and unsettled her. She'd avoided him all day, making excuses to keep herself busy. But now, as the house fell silent for the night, she couldn't get away from the thoughts that haunted her. Ashley exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair to steady herself. She told herself she was overthinking and reading too much into every interaction. But the memory of Ethan's intense gaze at her in the kitchen, as he spoke, was impossible to forget. It had ignited something in her, a spark she couldn't put out no matter how hard she tried. The sound of the stairs creaking distracted her from her thoughts. Ashley's breath hitched as she looked toward the doorway, her heart pounding with anticipation. A moment later, Ethan appeared, his figure illuminated by the soft light that spilled into the hallway. He hesitated, his dark eyes meeting hers, and the silence between them was almost deafening. "Couldn't sleep?" he inquired, his tone low and almost tentative. Ashley shook her head and forced a small smile. "No, just restless." Ethan nodded and stepped deeper into the room. He moved with quiet confidence, his presence filling the room in a way that made Ashley's heart race. He sat at the opposite end of the sofa, keeping a safe distance between them. But even that felt too close. "Long day?" he inquired, his tone casual, but there was an edge to his words that hinted at something deeper. Ashley shrugged and tightened her fingers around the hem of her sweater. "Something like that." They fell into a comfortable yet suffocating silence. Ashley could feel Ethan's gaze on her, as if it were pressing down on her physically. She refused to look into his eyes, instead focusing on the flickering flame of the candle on the coffee table. "You've been avoiding me?" Ethan said abruptly, cutting through the silence. Ashley's head snapped up, and her eyes met his in surprise. "I have not," she replied too quickly. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a faint smile forming on the corners of his lips. "You have," he said, his voice soft but insistent, "and I think we both know why." Ashley felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and frustration. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice defensive. "Yes, you do," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "This, whatever is happening between us, you feel it too, don't you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, daring her to confront the truth she had been attempting to deny. Ashley's breath caught, her thoughts spiraling as she struggled to find the right words. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the intensity in his voice and the way he looked at her made it impossible. "Ethan, this isn't," she trailed off, her voice faltering. "This isn't something we should be discussing." Why not? He countered, his tone almost pleading. Why do we have to keep pretending that there is nothing here? Because it's complicated? She explained, her voice breaking. Because it's not right. But it feels right, Ethan said, his gaze fixed on hers. You can't tell me you don't feel it, too. Ashley looked away, her hands gripping her lap as she fought to steady herself. The truth was there, hanging in the air, impossible to deny. She did feel it. The connection, the pull, the inexplicable bond that had formed between them, but admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff, and she wasn't ready to fall. I don't know, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved around the table. He knelt beside her, his presence overwhelming, and reached for her hand. You know, he said softly, and so do I. His touch was warm and steady, grounding her in a moment that felt like it could shatter at any time. Ashley's eyes welled up with tears, the weight of her emotions threatening to crush her. She looked down at him, her breath hitching as she met his gaze. Her voice trembled as she said, "This isn't fair to you. To me." "It's not about fair," Ethan said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's about what's real." Ashley closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her sea. I don't even know where to start. Together, the walls she had built around herself, the barriers she had carefully maintained, were crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't even know where to start. You don't have to, Ethan said, tightening his grip around hers. We'll figure it out. Together. The room fell silent once more, the weight of his words settling over them. Ashley's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, her heart aching from the impossible choices before her. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the connection they shared, but the fear of what lay ahead held her back. As they sat there, the night stretched on, each second heavy with unspoken promises and unanswered questions between them, and Ashley couldn't help but wonder if she had already crossed a line from which she would never be able to return. Ashley stirred in her bed, her eyes fluttering open to the muted hum of the world waking up outside, and the morning light spilled through the curtains, soft and diffused, painting the room in hues of gold and shadow. For a fleeting moment, she felt suspended in time, caught in that delicate space between sleep and consciousness. But then reality set in, heavy and unrelenting, and the events of the night before came flooding back with a clarity that made her heart race. She sat up slowly, her breath uneven, and pressed her hands to her face. The stillness of the house felt oppressive, with every sound amplified in the silence. The faint chirp of birds outside, the distant hum of a car engine, the steady thrum of her heartbeat. Ashley sat with her hands in her lap, gazing out the window. The sun was rising steadily, unconcerned about the chaos within her. Her mind replayed every moment, every word, every look. Ethan's confession, touch, and vulnerability in his eyes were imprinted on her memory, impossible to escape. She felt a tangle of emotions. Guilt, confusion, longing, all vying for dominance. Ashley swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cool hardwood floor. She rose unsteadily, wrapping her arms around herself as she made her way to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a version of herself she barely recognized. Her auburn hair was tousled, and her green eyes were rimmed with shadows from a restless night. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would wash away the weight pressing down on her chest. As she returned to the bedroom, her gaze was drawn to the chair by the window, where her sweater hung. It was the same sweater she had worn the night before, the one Ethan had brushed against when he knelt beside her. The memory made her pulse quicken, and she shook her head as if the act could erase the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. The faint clink of dishes broke the silence downstairs, and Ashley froze, her heart skipping a beat as she realized she wasn't alone. Ethan's presence was palpable, even from a distance, and she felt her stomach twist with anticipation and dread. Ashley hesitated in the doorway when she saw Ethan standing by the counter, his back to her, his movements deliberate as he poured a cup of coffee. He was dressed casually, his dark hair slightly messy, as if he, too, had spent the night lost in thought. She took a deep breath to steady herself before making her way down the stairs. The kitchen was bathed in sunlight, the warmth highlighting the simplicity of the space. "Morning," she finally said, her tone softer than she intended. Ethan turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread, before he offered a small, hesitant smile. "Morning." Ashley stepped into the room with caution, as if she were navigating a minefield. She reached for a mug, her hands trembling slightly, and poured herself a cup of coffee. The air between them was thick, charged with everything they weren't saying. "How'd you sleep?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Ashley looked at him, her lips curving into a faint, forced smile. "Not great." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, me neither." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound being the clink of Ashley's spoon against the mug. She avoided his gaze, focusing on the swirl of cream dissolving into her coffee, but she could feel his eyes on her, the intensity of his presence making her chest tighten. "I meant what I said last night," Ethan replied abruptly, his voice steady but soft. Ashley's hand froze mid-stir, her breath caught, and she looked up at him, her green eyes searching for answers she wasn't prepared to hear. "Ethan, I know it's complicated," he continued, stepping closer. "I know you're scared, so am I, but that doesn't change how I feel." Ashley set her mug down, her hands trembling as she braced herself against the counter, and closed her eyes, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. We can't just pretend this didn't happen," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not pretending," Ethan stated, his tone firm. "And I don't think you are either." Ashley turned to face him, her heart racing as she met his gaze. "Do you understand what you're saying? What are you asking?" "I do," he answered simply. "And I understand it's not fair. But I also understand that, whatever this is, it's real." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, and Ashley's resolve weakened. She wanted to deny it, tell him he was mistaken, but the truth was staring her in the face. The attraction between them, which had been building for days, was undeniable. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know where to start." Ethan reached out and gently brushed his hand against hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, reminding her of the emotions she had worked so hard to control. "We'll figure it out," he replied softly. "Together." Ashley looked down at their hands, her breath catching as she battled the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to get away, to hide in denial, but she couldn't. The connection between them was too strong, too genuine to ignore. "We can't rush this," she finally stated, her voice barely audible. "We should be careful." Ethan nodded, his expression earnest. "I understand, and I will follow your lead. I'm here for whatever you need." Ashley's chest ached as he spoke with sincerity and unwavering support in his eyes. She took a deep breath and tightened her fingers around the counter's edge to keep herself steady. "We'll talk later," she stated, her tone firmer. It is time to think." "Take all the time you need," Ethan said, his voice soft. "I'm not going anywhere." Ashley nodded, her gaze falling to her mug as she struggled to calm herself. The tension in the room had subsided slightly, but the weight of their conversation remained, a silent reminder of the decisions they had yet to make. As Ethan exited the room, Ashley stood alone, the sunlight streaming through the window casting long shadows on the floor. She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth grounding her as she stared out the window. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. Everything had changed, and there was no going back.